Hello, and welcome to this lesson on rendering displacement maps in Skin. In this lesson I'll be using the digital Emily assets. I'll cover how to correctly bake a displacement map from ZBrush and render it in Arnold. But in order to do this, first I'll show how to add detail to a face using an already existing displacement map. To start, let's look at Emily's displacement map in Photoshop. If I crank up the exposure, you can see areas are missing information. So if we bring the original map into ZBrush, wherever there is black in the texture, there should be no information to displace with. Now I'll bring this into ZBrush and flip the alpha vertically. It's really strong, so I'll set the intensity to something lower. You can see the blank spots where the texture was black in Photoshop. And apply the displacement map. Okay, 0.1 was way too strong. Maybe 0.01. That's better. And if applied to a layer, you can lower the layer's strength to fine-tune it. So the skin texture looks fine, it's just missing some detail spots. The displacement image is 32-bit, so the information is in there. I just need to adjust the exposure and the gamma to bring the levels into range. This wouldn't be a problem if ZBrush accepted 32-bit texture imports, but it doesn't. I'll use the same exposure node to adjust the values into range. A neutral gray is good. I'll try to eliminate any black spots in key areas. And change this to a 16-bit image. Select Don't Merge. And change to grayscale. Don't merge and discard the color information. Save this out as a TIFF. So just to be clean, I'll set up the model again from scratch and subdivide it 5 times to hit 6 million polygons. Create a new layer. In ZBrush, a new texture needs to be made as well, or the displacement map won't work. And flip the alpha vertically. I still don't know why ZBrush reads textures upside down, but it does. Through trial and error, I've determined that mid-value should be 0.276. Setting the mid-value prevents the displacement from moving too far in or out when applied. And some fine-tuning of the layer strength. Okay, that looks pretty good for the purposes that I need to use this for. Now on to baking the displacement maps. Enable displacement. Expand export options. Enable 32-bit and EXR and set mid to 0. Click Create All Maps and choose where you want them exported to. So the reason to choose mid as 0 is because Arnold is happiest with mid being black. It's the easiest way to get correct peaks and valleys from your displacement maps. I'll show an example of a different mid value a little later on. Something to note. After the displacement bakes, it sets the layer strength back to 1. Keep this in mind if you're wondering why all of a sudden the detail is too strong. The map looks good, so bear with me for a second while I set up the Maya scene. I like to put my lights under a group node and use the group's centered pivot to spin the light around. For Arnold lights, it's best to set exposure rather than intensity. An optional set is to turn on GPU rendering. and increase the sampling to remove some of the noise. Now for the material setup. Click Displacement Map. Select File. Load the exported displacement map from ZBrush. Make sure the color space is set to raw. So this is decent looking, but the special sauce is in setting the subdivision. Set the type to Cat Clark. For iterations, 4 is fine. Enable Auto Bump. With this on, any detail not displaced due to subdivision will be added to the shading like a bump map. By saving a snapshot and comparing the before and after, next bring in the diffuse texture. Most diffuse textures will be sRGB. It just happens to be that this texture was saved in raw color space. And now for the big payoff, subsurface. Set the weight to 1. This effectively 100% overwrites the diffuse parameter. Now subsurface is completely driving the color. Lower the scale to 0.1, and random walk is fine. Drop the same diffuse color texture into the subsurface color channel. And now, for arguably the most important part, set the radius color correctly. Change to RGB 0 to 1 range, and set R to 1, green to 0.35, and blue to 0.2. The reasoning behind this is that red light penetrates furthest into the skin, green light less so, and blue light even less. So by setting RGB to 1, 0.35, and 2, we're controlling how deep each color of the light is traveling, which is also why sometimes you might see reflections or specularity set to a light blue on the skin, because you're seeing more blue light reflected at the surface and more red light penetrating into the skin. Play around with the values to see how this affects the subsurface. Click on the displacement shader node and adjust the scale to lessen the effect. Here I'm adding some coat value to give a dual lobe reflection. One lobe being a tighter, brighter reflection, and the other being wider and softer. Next, I'll add a sky dome light for some ambience. .05 intensity is fine. Checking the skin from different light angles, it's already looking pretty good. So that's pretty much it for how to render a displacement map from ZBrush with a mid value of 0. Now I'll show you a mid value of 0.5, and while it will still work, it isn't ideal or as easy to set up. Back in ZBrush, set the mid value to 0.5, and export again. Be sure to save as a different file so you don't overwrite the previous displacement map. So on the right is the mid-0 displacement map, and on the left is 0.5. Here I'm just hitting auto levels on the maps to preview the details. I won't resave the file. Straight out of ZBrush is best. Now back in Maya, let's change the displacement map. Instead of replacing the texture, I'll create another displacement material connection, the same way as before. Now when rendered, everything is puffy, because the default settings are for a mid-0. Changing the scale only lessens the entire displacement, not the desired effect. To fix this, the scalar 0 value needs to be set correctly. If the midpoint is 0.5 in ZBrush, and the strength is 1 in Arnold, then the scale 0 value should be 0.5 as well. But it still looks pretty nuts. When the scale and the displacement is reduced, scalar 0 value also needs to be reduced. .25 looks better. Export the model from ZBrush to perfectly check the displacement volume. The ZBrush export and the mid-value 0.5 displacement map is a little bit off. It's still probably fine, but it's more difficult to set up and work with than a mid-value of 0. Now I'll check the mid-0 and the imported model. I'm saving a couple snapshots to compare the results. Hooking up the original displacement node with the gray mid-value of 0 and toggling between the two, we can see that they're a perfect match. So there you have it. How to add detail to a model from a displacement map, how to bake a displacement map to a texture, and setting up the scene and material to render the displacement map. For the sake of this topic, only a diffuse and displacement map was used, and the results were already pretty good. Obviously, if you put some time into creating a roughness and specular map, it'll look even better. I hope this helps. Happy rendering!